Whispers echoed through the vaulted ceilings of the sprawling Scottish estate, dripping with malice and old money arrogance. A billionaire groom had just locked his bride away in a servant's parlor, desperate to protect her from the cruel judgment of the barons and tech moguls attending their wedding. His own mother had spent months convincing high society that the girl was a low-class opportunist, entirely unfit to walk the aisle. But as the organ swelled and the elites sneered at the empty altar, the heavy oak doors violently swung open. It wasn't the bride who entered. It was Her Majesty the Queen, flanked by royal guards bringing the ceremony to a dead halt, with a single earth-shattering demand regarding the woman hidden upstairs. To understand the sheer magnitude of the scandal that unfolded at Highfield Manor, you first have to understand the terrifying social gravity of the Davenport family. Harrison Davenport was the sole heir to a global shipping empire that moved half the world's cargo. His family didn't just have money, they had generations of ruthless, terrifying influence. They were the kind of people who could bankrupt a small country before breakfast and attend a charity gala in the evening without blinking an eye. And then there was Madeline Foster. Madeline was an archivist at an obscure historical library in London. She spent her days surrounded by fragile, centuries-old manuscripts, wearing oversized knit sweaters and tortoiseshell glasses. She was soft-spoken, fiercely intelligent, and possessed a quiet, unassuming beauty that Harrison had fallen desperately in love with when he ducked into her library during a sudden downpour 2 years prior. Their romance was a whirlwind of stolen moments in quiet cafes far away from the flashing cameras and the suffocating expectations of Harrison's world. But Harrison's mother, Camilla Davenport, was a woman who viewed marriage not as a union of souls, but as a corporate merger. Camilla had spent 30 years cultivating a social circle of European aristocrats, political titans, and billionaires. She had fully expected Harrison to marry a duchess, or at the very least the daughter of a prominent senator. When Harrison brought Madeline home, a girl with no pedigree, no trust fund, and a resume that consisted of sorting old letters, Camilla's blood ran cold. From the moment the engagement was announced, Camilla launched a quiet psychological war against her future daughter-in-law. It was never overt. It was a million tiny freezing cuts designed to make Madeline feel smaller than a speck of dust. The nightmare reached its peak the weekend of the wedding. Highfield Manor, the Davenports' ancestral home in the countryside, was completely overrun by the global elite. We are talking about hundreds of guests whose net worths required commas upon commas. Helicopters landed on the lawn every 20 minutes. The gravel driveway was choked with Rolls-Royces and armored Mercedes. On the evening of the rehearsal gala, Madeline wore a simple, elegant ivory slip dress. It wasn't covered in Swarovski crystals, and it didn't have a designer label screamed across the tag. As she descended the grand staircase, the murmurs from the ballroom below instantly hushed. Eyes tracked her like predators sizing up a wounded fawn. Camilla intercepted her before she could even reach the bottom step. The Madeline darling. Camilla purred her fingers, digging just a little too sharply into Madeline's arm. You look incredibly comfortable. Thank you, Mrs. Davenport, Madeline said softly, her stomach twisting into anxious knots. Ah, listen to me closely, my sweet, Camilla whispered, her voice dropping to a low, venomous frequency. The ambassador of Spain is in the drawing room. The CEO of Vanguard is by the fireplace. These people discuss global economics, fine art, and geopolitical strategy. You, my dear catalog dusty papers. Harrison is currently trying to secure a multi-billion-dollar port contract with the Duke of Somerset. If you go in there, you will have nothing to say. You will embarrass yourself, and worse, you will embarrass my son. Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. Harrison asked me to meet him by the terrace. While Harrison is blinded by affection, Camilla interrupted, smiling brightly for the passing waiters, while her eyes remained completely dead. He doesn't see how out of depth you are, but I do. As a favor to him and to save you the absolute humiliation of standing in a corner like a lost stray, I have instructed the staff to set up a private dinner for you in the East Wing Conservatory. You can read a book, relax. Let Harrison handle the heavy lifting tonight. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a perfectly executed social exile. Madeline, whose only desire was to avoid causing a massive scene on the eve of her wedding, swallowed the massive lump in her throat. She looked at the glittering ballroom, heard the booming laughter of the billionaires, and felt utterly painfully alone. To protect Harrison's peace of mind, she nodded. For the entirety of her own rehearsal gala, the bride sat alone in a drafty glass-walled conservatory at the far end of the estate, picking at a plate of cold salmon while the elite guests partied just a few hundred feet away. Every time a servant came in to refill her water, they offered her a look of deep, profound pity. The bride had been successfully hidden, and Camilla Davenport was absolutely thrilled. The morning of the wedding broke with a heavy, oppressive fog rolling over the Scottish hills. The estate was practically vibrating with the chaotic energy of florists, caterers, and high society stylists running through the halls. For a wedding of this magnitude, the bride is traditionally placed in the estate's Grand Master suite, surrounded by a team of makeup artists popping champagne with her bridesmaids. Instead, Madeline had been relegated to a small, dusty guest room in the servants' quarters. Camilla had effortlessly claimed the master suite was suffering from a sudden plumbing issue and had placed a prominent tech heiress in the only other suitable room. Madeline sat in front of a small tarnished mirror, applying her own makeup. Her hands trembled slightly. She had no bridesmaids. Camilla had vetoed Madeline's 2 childhood friends, claiming the wedding was strictly limited capacity for VIPs, effectively isolating Madeline entirely. Around 10 a.m., the heavy wooden door burst open. Harrison stood in the doorway, his tuxedo half unbuttoned his face, flushed with absolute fury. He had spent the previous night thinking Madeline had gone to bed early due to a migraine, a lie flawlessly delivered by his mother. He had only just discovered through a guilty-looking housemaid where his bride had been banished. "We are leaving," Harrison said, his voice shaking with a rage Madeline had never seen before. He crossed the room and grabbed her small duffel bag. "We are getting in my car right now. We are driving to London, and we are eloping. I'm going to tear this entire estate down to the foundation." Madeline stood up quickly, catching his arm. "Harrison, stop!" "No, Madeline." "Do you know what she told the guests downstairs? I just walked past the morning parlor. My mother is telling the board of directors that you are too fragile and lacking the refinement to handle a social mourning. She is treating you like a dirty secret. I will not let her do this to you. I am going down there to call this whole thing off." "Harrison, look at me," Madeline said firmly, her voice steadying him. She placed both hands on his chest. "I am not marrying your mother. I am not marrying the board of directors or the ambassador or the duke. I am marrying you. If we run away, she wins. She proves to everyone that I am too weak for your world. I will not give her the satisfaction." Harrison stared at her, his jaw tight, his eyes shining with unshed tears of frustration. "You shouldn't have to endure this." "I can endure anything for another 2 hours," Madeline whispered, smiling softly. "Just meet me at the altar. Once we say, 'I do,' your mother will never be able to dismiss me again." Harrison pulled her into a tight, desperate embrace, kissing her forehead, before reluctantly stepping away. 2 hours. I'll be waiting." As Harrison left to face the lions downstairs, Madeline turned back to her small vanity. She reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out a battered velvet-lined wooden box. It was the only thing she possessed from her mother, who had passed away when Madeline was just a child. Her mother, a fiercely private woman who spoke with a strange, unidentifiable accent and insisted on teaching Madeline flawless French and royal protocol as a fun game, had left strict instructions with Madeline's adoptive aunt. "Give this to her on the morning of her wedding." Madeline clicked the small brass latch. The box opened, and despite the dim lighting of the servants' quarters, the contents seemed to catch and refract every ounce of light in the room. It was a necklace. But not just any necklace. It was a suffocatingly heavy, breathtakingly intricate piece of antique jewelry. 3 massive, flawless teardrop rubies hung suspended from a thick collar of interwoven diamonds. It was so opulent, so terrifyingly regal, that it looked less like jewelry and more like an ancient artifact stolen from a museum vault. There was a small handwritten note tucked beneath it. "My dearest Madeline, I gave up my world so you could have a normal life free from the cages of crowns and courts. But today you are a bride. Do not let anyone make you feel small. Wear this and remember whose blood runs in your veins." Madeline stared at the note, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. She didn't fully understand the cryptic message, but the weight of the necklace in her hands felt like armor. Camilla Davenport wanted a high society spectacle. She wanted to prove Madeline was nothing. Madeline carefully unhooked the clasp and secured the cold, heavy diamonds around her neck. The rubies rested fiercely against her collarbone, blazing like fire against the simple white silk of her dress. She didn't know where the necklace came from, but for the first time all weekend, the invisible bride felt utterly indestructible. By 1 p.m., the private chapel on the estate grounds was packed shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful people on the continent. The air was thick with the scent of imported white lilies and the low, buzzing hum of wealthy gossip. Sebastian Mercer, a hedge fund titan, leaned over his mahogany pew to whisper to Penelope Astor, a socialite draped in Chanel. "I bet 100,000 pounds the girl trips on her own train." Sebastian snickered. "Oh, please, I'll be shocked if Camilla even lets her walk down the aisle." Penelope murmured back behind a gloved hand. "I heard she locked the poor thing in the scullery to keep her from frightening the investors." In the front row, Camilla Davenport sat like a reigning monarch, her chin held high, radiating absolute triumph. She had orchestrated this perfectly. Madeline had been thoroughly broken, hidden away from sight, and would likely shuffle down the aisle looking exactly like the terrified, out-of-place commoner Camilla always claimed she was. At the altar, Harrison stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His eyes locked furiously on the heavy oak double doors at the back of the chapel. The string quartet in the corner began to play the opening notes of the bridal chorus. A hushed anticipation fell over the crowd. But the doors didn't open. A minute passed. Then 2. The music swelled, looped, and began to sound distinctly awkward. Whispers erupted throughout the pews. Camilla's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a scowl of intense irritation. How dare that little mouse ruin the scheduling, she thought. Suddenly, the deafening roar of helicopter blades shattered the serene quiet of the estate. It was so loud and so close that the stained glass windows of the chapel literally rattled in their frames. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly. The guests turned around in their pews, murmuring in alarm. Before anyone could stand, the heavy oak doors of the chapel were blown open, but it wasn't the bride. 4 men in immaculate dark tactical suits stepped into the chapel. They wore earpieces and moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, instantly taking up positions at the corners of the room. The billionaires and politicians in the crowd recognized high-level state security when they saw it. A deathly silence fell over the room. Then a 5th man stepped through the doors, striking a heavy silver-tipped cane against the stone floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming with unquestionable authority, "please rise for Her Majesty Queen Isabella of the Royal House." A collective gasp sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The guests, arrogant, untouchable elites, instantly scrambled to their feet. Chairs scraped violently against the stone floor. Even Sebastian Mercer looked like he was going to faint. Queen Isabella, the reigning monarch of one of Europe's most powerful royal families, stepped into the doorway. She was an imposing figure, draped in a tailored crimson coat, her silver hair pulled back flawlessly, her posture radiating and intimidating ancient power. Flanked by military generals adorned in medals, she looked down the aisle of the chapel with a terrifyingly cold expression. Camilla Davenport practically climbed over the pew to get to the aisle. Her heart was hammering out of her chest. This was it. This was the ultimate validation. A reigning monarch had somehow heard of the Davenport wedding and decided to grace them with her presence. Camilla's social status was about to become immortal. She rushed forward, dropping into a deep, desperate curtsy right in the middle of the aisle. Your Majesty. Camilla breathed, her voice trembling with sycophantic joy. We are beyond honored. Words cannot express the profound privilege of welcoming you to Highfield Manor for my son's wedding. Please allow me to escort you to the VIP seating. Queen Isabella did not look at Camilla. She did not acknowledge the curtsy. She simply stopped walking, forcing Camilla to stay awkwardly crouched on the floor. The Queen's piercing blue eyes scanned the room, sweeping over the terrified faces of the elite guests, completely ignoring the desperate mother of the groom at her feet. I have not traveled across the channel to attend a social networking event, Mrs. Davenport. The Queen's voice cut through the silence like a freshly sharpened blade. Every word echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Camilla faltered slowly, rising from her curtsy, her face draining of color. I don't understand, Your Majesty. If you aren't here for the wedding, why are you here? Queen Isabella finally looked down at Camilla, her expression one of utter terrifying disgust. I am here, the Queen stated coldly loud enough for every billionaire and baron in the room to hear, because my intelligence division informed me that my late sister's only child, the legitimate princess of our bloodline, has been placed in a servant's quarter by a family of shipping merchants. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so quiet you could hear the wax dripping from the candles at the altar. Harrison's jaw dropped. The elite guests froze their eyes, widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. Camilla staggered backward, physically recoiling as if she had been slapped. Princess. She choked out her voice, barely a squeak. There is no princess here, Your Majesty. My son is marrying a librarian, a girl named Madeline. A girl named Madeline. The Queen interrupted, stepping forward and forcing Camilla to scurry out of her path. Who is wearing the blood rubies of the royal vault? A gift I gave my sister before she vanished into hiding 25 years ago. The Queen struck her cane against the floor once more, the sound echoing like a gunshot. She turned to her commanding officer. Clear the halls. Queen Isabella ordered, her voice trembling with a mixture of royal fury and profound emotion. Find my niece and bring her to me immediately. The command hung in the air of the chapel, heavy and suffocating. Queen Isabella did not wait for an answer. She turned her back on the trembling mass of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and global socialites, striking her silver-tipped cane against the ancient stone floor once more. At that exact signal, the 4 elite state security operatives men, drawn from the highest tiers of international intelligence, whose stern faces betrayed absolutely zero emotion, pivoted in unison. They did not ask Camilla Davenport for directions. They did not request a floor plan of Highfield Manor. When you possess the backing of sovereign intelligence, you already know the blueprints of the house you are entering better than the people who hold the deed. Secure the perimeter. No one enters or exits this chapel. The lead operative, a broad-shouldered man named Commander Thomas, barked into his wrist communicator. Instantly, 2 more guards materialized at the chapel doors, crossing their arms, effectively taking 300 of the world's wealthiest individuals hostage in a church. Inside the manor, the scene was entirely different. The vast, echoing halls of the Davenport estate, usually filled with the arrogant strides of shipping magnates and tech tycoons, were now conquered by the precise, rhythmic thud of military boots. The Queen walked with a terrifying, purposeful grace, her crimson coat sweeping past the priceless Renaissance paintings and imported mean vases that lined the walls. To her, this ostentatious display of wealth was nothing more than the loud, vulgar clattering of new money. They bypassed the Grand Master suites. They bypassed the lavish guest wings with their vaulted ceilings and Egyptian cotton linens. Instead, the commander led the Queen down a narrow, uncarpeted hallway hidden behind a swinging door near the kitchens, the servants' quarters. The air here was starkly colder, smelling of bleach and old wood, a cruel contrast to the imported floral arrangements suffocating the rest of the estate. At the very end of the hall, behind a scuffed wooden door with a tarnished brass knob, Madeline sat in silence. She had heard the helicopters. She had felt the low rumbling vibration of the rotors shaking the thin glass of her single drafty window. Her heart was beating frantically against her ribs, the heavy antique rubies feeling strangely warm against her skin. She had assumed it was another one of Camilla's ostentatious guests, arriving late, perhaps a foreign dignitary, or a Hollywood executive making a grand disruptive entrance. She had no idea her entire reality was about to fracture. When the heavy footsteps stopped outside her door, Madeline stood up, smoothing the simple silk of her unadorned gown. She expected Harrison. She expected him to come bursting in, furious, and ready to tear the house down as he had promised. Instead, the door was unceremoniously pushed open by Commander Thomas, who stepped inside, quickly scanned the tiny, dusty room for threats, and then stepped back, bowing his head in deep reverence. Madeline blinked, utterly bewildered by the tactical gear and the sudden suffocating intensity in the room. Then Queen Isabella stepped across the threshold. The tiny room seemed to shrink impossibly under the sheer weight of the monarch's presence. For a long, agonizing moment, neither woman spoke. The queen, whose face was famously plastered across global currency and international news networks, stood perfectly still. Her piercing blue eyes locked onto Madeline. Madeline felt the breath leave her lungs. She had studied European history. She knew exactly who this woman was. Instinctively, her hands flew to her sides, and she attempted a clumsy, terrified curtsy, her mind scrambling to understand why a reigning sovereign was standing in a Davenport broom closet. Your Majesty," Madeline stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I don't understand." Queen Isabella did not acknowledge the curtsy. Her icy demeanor, the terrifying mask she had worn in the chapel, was rapidly dissolving. Her eyes dropped from Madeline's face to the breathtaking, blindingly bright ruby necklace resting against the bride's collarbone, the blood rubies. A sharp, ragged gasp escaped the queen's lips. It was a sound of profound, decades-old grief crashing into overwhelming relief. She took a step forward, her silver cane trembling slightly in her grip. "You have her eyes?" The queen whispered, her voice cracking, shedding the royal authority to reveal the desperate aunt beneath. "My God, you have Vivienne's eyes." Madeline froze, her blood running cold. "Vivienne, my mother's name was Valerie." "Valerie was a ghost," the queen said softly, closing the distance between them and reaching out a gloved hand. She didn't touch Madeline, hovering just inches from her cheek, as if afraid the girl might shatter like glass. "Valerie was a fabricated identity constructed by MY6 26 years ago. Your mother was Princess Vivienne, my younger sister, the true heir to the southern estates and the bravest woman I ever knew." Madeline's mind went entirely blank. The small, tarnished mirror, the dusty floorboards, the distant hum of the estate, everything seemed to violently spin. She thought of her mother, the quiet woman who spoke flawless, aristocratic French, who insisted on perfect posture, who had died of a sudden illness when Madeline was only 8, leaving her in the care of a distant, fiercely protective aunt. "No." Madeline breathed, shaking her head, stepping back until her spine hit the edge of the small vanity. "No, you must be mistaken. I'm an archivist. I live in a flat in London. My mother was a translator." "Your mother was a target," Queen Isabella corrected, her voice hardening with protective fury. "When our father died, a radical faction attempted a violent coup to seize the throne. They assassinated 2 of our cousins. Vivienne was next. To protect the bloodline and to protect you, who was still in her womb, she renounced her titles, took the rubies as her only severance, and vanished into the shadows of the United Kingdom. We spent millions trying to track her, but she had the best intelligence agents in the world hiding her. The queen finally reached out her gloved fingers, gently touching the heavy diamond setting of the necklace. She left you this so that when you were ready, when you were safe and grown, you could prove exactly who you are. The queen said, a fierce blazing pride igniting in her eyes. You are not a commoner, Madeline. You are a princess of the royal blood, and I will be damned before I let a family of arrogant cargo shippers lock my niece in a scullery on her wedding day. Back in the Grand Chapel, the atmosphere had deteriorated into pure, unadulterated panic. The elites, usually so composed and untouchable, were sweating through their bespoke designer suits. The armed guards at the doors remained completely motionless, their hands resting ominously near their holsters. In the front row, Camilla Davenport was experiencing a catastrophic psychological collapse. She was pacing the narrow space between the pews, hyperventilating her manicured fingers, twisting her expensive pearl necklace so violently the string was threatening to snap. It's a mistake. It's a misunderstanding. Camilla muttered frantically to the CEO of Vanguard Group, who was actively trying to edge away from her. The queen is confused. Madeline is a nobody. She catalogs old newspapers. Her parents had no money. This is some sort of elaborate stunt. Sebastian Mercer, the hedge fund titan who had mocked Madeline just moments before, wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead. Camilla, shut up, he hissed venomously. That is the sovereign head of state. If she says the girl is royalty, you nod your head and you grovel. Do you want to lose every government contract in Europe by tomorrow morning? At the altar, Harrison was the only person breathing normally. His shock at the Queen's arrival had morphed into something entirely different, absolute vindicated awe. He didn't care about crowns or titles. He only cared that the woman he loved, the woman his mother had spent months trying to destroy, was currently being rescued by the highest authority on the continent. He stood tall, adjusting his cuffs, a dangerous, triumphant smile playing on his lips as he looked down at his hyperventilating mother. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel groaned open once more. The silence that instantly slammed down over the room was deafening. Even the rustling of silk dresses ceased. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto the entryway. Commander Thomas stepped through first, but he did not take a defensive posture. Instead, he snapped to rigid attention, executing a flawless, razor-sharp military salute. The other guards mirrored his movement instantly. From the shadows of the vestibule, the bride emerged. If Madeline Foster had walked up those stairs an invisible, terrified commoner, the woman who descended them was a terrifying force of nature. It wasn't the dress she still wore, the simple, unadorned ivory silk. It was the posture. It was the sudden, undeniable realization of her own bloodline radiating from her spine. The oppressive weight of the Davenport wealth no longer terrified her. Compared to a 1,000-year-old dynasty, these billionaires were merely merchants playing dress-up. And then there were the rubies. As Madeline stepped into the light of the chapel, the blood rubies ignited. The massive, flawless gems caught the sunlight filtering through the stained glass, casting violent blood-red refractions across the stone walls. It was a piece of jewelry so historically significant, so unfathomably expensive, that several socialites in the back rows audibly gasped, physically recoiling from the sheer magnitude of the wealth draped around her neck. Queen Isabella walked a half step behind Madeline, her expression one of ferocious, untouchable dominance. As Madeline walked down the aisle, the dynamic of the room violently shifted. These were people who understood power. They lived for it, breathed it, and worshipped it. And right now the ultimate power was walking past them. Without a word being spoken, Penelope Astor, the socialite draped in Chanel, instinctively lowered her head and dropped into a deep, shaking curtsy. A ripple effect tore through the pews. Hedge fund managers, tech billionaires, and arrogant aristocrats who had spent the entire weekend openly mocking the librarian bride were now scrambling to bow and curtsy, their eyes glued to the stone floor in sheer terror of offending the crown. Camilla Davenport watched this happen, her mind completely short-circuiting. Her reality was breaking apart. The girl she had locked in a drafty servant's room, the girl she had starved at the rehearsal dinner, was currently parting an ocean of the world's elite like a reigning goddess. When Madeline reached the front of the aisle, she did not look at Camilla. She didn't even spare the woman a passing glance. Her eyes were locked entirely on Harrison. Harrison didn't wait for protocol. He didn't care that the Queen of Europe was standing 3 feet away. He stepped down from the elevated altar, crossed the remaining distance, and took Madeline's hands in his. His eyes swept over the massive rubies and then back up to her face, a breathless, incredulous laugh escaping his chest. "I was going to come get you," Harrison whispered fiercely, his thumbs tracing the back of her trembling hands. "I was on my way. I know." Madeline smiled, a single tear slipping down her cheek, completely ignoring the hundreds of stunned elites watching them. "But my aunt beat you to it." The reunion at the altar was abruptly shattered by the sound of Camilla Davenport's frantic, desperate voice. "Your Majesty, please." Camilla surged forward from her pew, practically throwing herself toward the altar, her face a mask of sweating, desperate sycophancy. This is a miracle, a blessed miracle. We had no idea of Madeline's true pedigree. Had we known, we would have hosted her in the grand suite. We would have thrown a royal gala. Please allow us to restart the ceremony. Let me make the proper announcements to the press." Silence. Queen Isabella didn't yell. She didn't have to. The single word cracked like a whip through the silent chapel, instantly paralyzing Camilla in her tracks. The Queen stepped forward, placing herself squarely between Camilla and the bride. She looked at the Davenport matriarch as if she were inspecting a particularly repulsive insect that had crawled onto her shoe. "You will make no announcements." "Mrs. Davenport," the Queen said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal calm. "You will not speak to the press. In fact, you will not speak another word for the remainder of this day unless spoken to. Is that entirely clear?" Camilla's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. She looked around desperately at her wealthy friends, hoping for backup, but the billionaires were staring rigidly ahead, utterly terrified of catching the monarch's crosshairs. Camilla swallowed hard, her face draining of all blood, and gave a sharp, pathetic nod. "Right? Excellent." Queen Isabella continued, her voice echoing perfectly off the vaulted ceilings. "Because let me make one thing abundantly clear to every elite guest sitting in this room." The Queen slowly turned, her piercing gaze sweeping over the terrified crowd. "The woman standing before you is Princess Madeline of the royal house. Her personal inheritance, held in blind trust since the day her mother vanished, eclipses the net worth of every shipping vessel this family owns combined. She possesses titles older than the countries most of your corporations operate in, but she did not come here today relying on that power." The Queen turned her gaze back to Camilla, her eyes narrowing with lethal precision. "She came here as a humble, intelligent woman who loved your son. And you, Camilla, blinded by your own vulgar, desperate obsession with social climbing, looked at a princess and saw garbage. You locked royal blood in a scullery because her dress wasn't expensive enough for your taste. You have exposed yourself, not only as a fool, but as a classless, cruel woman. The absolute humiliation was total. Camilla Davenport, a woman who had spent 30 years building an impenetrable fortress of social supremacy, was being publicly, ruthlessly dismantled by the highest authority on earth. Several executives in the pews actually winced. There was no coming back from this. The Davenport social standing was being incinerated in real time. However, Queen Isabella suddenly pivoted, her icy demeanor softening just a fraction as she looked at Harrison. The towering, furious Groom had not let go of Madeline's hands once. "Mr. Davenport," the Queen addressed him directly, "my intelligence officers informed me of your reaction when you discovered where my niece had been hidden. I am told you were prepared to tear this estate to the ground and abandon your family's fortune to protect her." Harrison stood taller, meeting the sovereign's gaze without an ounce of intimidation. "I was your Majesty, and I still am. I didn't fall in love with a princess. I fell in love with a librarian who gets ink on her fingers and reads by the window. Whatever titles she holds, whatever wealth she has, it doesn't change a thing. She is my world, and if my family cannot respect her, I have no family." The sincerity in his voice was unbreakable. It rang out through the chapel, a stark, beautiful contrast to the toxic ambition that had poisoned the weekend. Queen Isabella studied him for a long, intense moment. The silence was thick, pregnant with the weight of a sovereign's judgment. Finally, a very small, genuine smile touched the corners of the Queen's lips. Good." The Queen nodded approvingly. She struck her cane against the floor one last time. "Then this wedding will proceed, but it will no longer be a Davenport affair. As of this moment, this ceremony is under the jurisdiction of the Crown." The Queen gestured sharply to Commander Thomas. "Commander, remove Mrs. Davenport from the front row. She may observe from the back vestibule where she will not spoil my view." Camilla let out a strangled, horrified gasp. The back row. But I am the mother of the groom." "You are a spectator," the Queen corrected coldly. "And you're lucky I'm not having you escorted off the property entirely. Move." Two armed operatives instantly stepped forward, grasping Camilla by the elbows. The once untouchable matriarch of the Davenport Empire was practically dragged down the aisle, weeping and sputtering past the snickering hedge fund managers and terrified socialites, and shoved into a cramped wooden chair at the very back of the church. Queen Isabella then turned to the pale, trembling archbishop, standing at the altar, who looked like he was about to faint from the sheer stress of the situation. "Well," the Queen prompted, raising a single elegant eyebrow. "Are you waiting for a written invitation, Bishop Merrytham?" The Archbishop of Canterbury, a man who had presided over the funerals of prime ministers and the baptisms of global heirs, visibly swallowed hard. His hands, usually so steady holding the sacred texts, trembled as he opened his gilded prayer book. It was one thing to conduct a high society wedding for a billionaire shipping magnate. It was an entirely different, terrifying ordeal to officiate under the piercing, unblinking scrutiny of Queen Isabella, who had positioned herself just a few feet away, leaning heavily on her silver-tipped cane like an ancient avenging deity. The chapel, previously buzzing with the toxic, arrogant whispers of the global elite, was now trapped in a vacuum of suffocating silence. You could hear the faint rustle of the Archbishop's vestments and the distant rhythmic thumping of the Royal Guard's boots patrolling the perimeter outside the stained-glass windows. 300 of the most powerful CEOs, aristocrats, and politicians on the planet sat completely paralyzed in the wooden pews, their eyes darting nervously between the heavily armed operatives securing the doors and the blinding, fiery glow of the blood rubies resting against the bride's collarbone. Dearly beloved. The Archbishop began, his voice cracking slightly on the first syllable. He cleared his throat, a sharp flush of red creeping up his neck. "We are gathered here today in the presence of God, and of course Her Majesty, to witness the holy union of Harrison John Davenport and—" The Archbishop paused, sudden panic seizing his features. He looked toward the Queen, utterly terrified of misidentifying the woman standing at the altar. He had a script prepared for Madeline Foster Archivist. He did not have a script for a secret royal heir. Her Royal Highness Princess Madeline of the House of Valerius. Queen Isabella supplied coldly, her voice echoing perfectly off the vaulted stone ceiling. "You may proceed, Bishop." "And Her Royal Highness Princess Madeline." The Archbishop repeated swiftly, practically wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. Despite the sheer world-shattering absurdity of the situation, Madeline felt a strange, profound sense of peace wash over her. The crushing anxiety that had plagued her for the last 48 hours, the fear of tripping, the terror of saying the wrong thing to a diplomat, the suffocating weight of Camilla Davenport's psychological warfare had completely evaporated. It wasn't just the protection of the crown that grounded her. It was the look in Harrison's eyes. Harrison stood before her, his broad shoulders relaxed, a fiercely proud and entirely devoted smile lighting up his face. He didn't care about the heavily armed intelligence officers in the corners. He didn't care about his mother weeping in the back row. He only saw Madeline. He reached out, taking both of her trembling hands in his own, his thumbs gently sweeping across her knuckles to ground her in the present moment. "I told you," Harrison whispered so quietly that only she could hear him over the Archbishop's droning prayer. "You were always too good for this room." Madeline smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that made the heavy diamonds and rubies around her neck pale in comparison. "I think your mother is currently having a medical emergency in the vestibule," she whispered back, a tiny, uncharacteristic spark of mischief in her eyes. "Let her—" Harrison replied without missing a beat, his gaze never leaving Madeline's face. "She spent a year trying to convince me you were nothing. Today she has to watch you become everything." The ceremony proceeded not as the vulgar display of corporate wealth Camilla had meticulously planned, but as an intimate, fiercely protected vow between two people who had weathered a storm of toxic elitism. When it came time for the vows, Harrison did not read from the heavily sanitized PR. Approved cue cards his mother had attempted to force upon him. Instead, he spoke entirely from the heart, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable conviction. "Madeline, I loved you in the quiet corners of the library when the world didn't know your name." Harrison said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the silent crowd. "And I love you now, standing in the crosshairs of 1,000 expectations. I promise to shield you from the vultures, to stand by your side, whether you are archiving forgotten letters or wearing the weight of a dynasty. You are my home. You are my only allegiance, for all the days of my life." Several socialites in the front rows, women who had spent the entire weekend mocking Madeline's simple wardrobe, suddenly found themselves dabbing desperately at their eyes with silk handkerchiefs, utterly captivated by the raw, undeniable devotion radiating from the groom. When it was Madeline's turn, she took a deep, steadying breath. She felt the heavy, ancient metal of the necklace warming against her skin, a phantom embrace from the mother she had lost, the warrior princess who had sacrificed her entire world just so Madeline could stand here today, safe and loved. Becky Harrison. Madeline began, her voice clear, melodic, and completely devoid of fear. "You found me hiding in the dust of history, and you made me feel entirely seen. You stood between me and a world that wanted to tear me down, ready to sacrifice your own empire to keep me safe. I don't know what tomorrow brings or what this new reality will demand of us, but I know that with you I am fearless. I take you as my husband, my protector, and my equal today and forever." "The rings," the Archbishop prompted, extending a silver velvet cushion. Harrison took the simple, elegant gold band he had chosen himself, expressly ignoring Camilla's demand for an ostentatious diamond-encrusted monstrosity, and slid it onto Madeline's finger. Madeline mirrored the action, her hands steady, her heart full. "By the power vested in me and under the watchful eye of the sovereign," the Archbishop declared, his confidence finally returning, now that the terrifying ordeal was almost over. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Harrison didn't hesitate. He pulled Madeline into his arms, dipping her slightly, and kissed her with a fierce, possessive passion that sent a jolt of electricity through the entire chapel. For a moment, the armed guards, the queen, the billionaires, and the ruined mother-in-law completely vanished. It was just the two of them, victorious and unbroken. When they finally broke apart, the chapel remained dead silent. Traditionally, this was the moment the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, but the elite guests were completely paralyzed. They did not know the protocol. Do you cheer for a secret royal? Do you wait for the queen to applaud first? Do you stand? The terrifying uncertainty had them practically vibrating in their pews. Queen Isabella, observing the pathetic frozen state of the world's most powerful people, gave a single dismissive scoff. She lifted her silver-tipped cane and struck it heavily against the stone floor. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It was a slow, rhythmic, terrifyingly deliberate applause. Instantly, the tension snapped. The hedge fund managers, the tech CEOs, The barons and the socialites scrambled to their feet, desperately joining the applause, clapping so hard and so frantically that their palms undoubtedly bruised. It was a deafening roar of absolute terrified sycophancy, directed entirely at the woman they had treated like dirt only hours before. Madeline turned to face the crowd, slipping her arm through Harrison's. She looked out over the sea of wildly applauding elites, her expression perfectly composed, radiating an icy, aristocratic grace she didn't even know she possessed. She did not wave. She did not smile. She simply acknowledged their sudden devotion with a slow, regal nod. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle, the guests bowed and curtsied as they passed, effectively parting like the Red Sea. But the ultimate victory lay at the very back of the chapel. In the darkest, draftiest corner of the vestibule, guarded by two unblinking state security operatives, sat Camilla Davenport. Her immaculate designer fascinator was slightly askew. Her flawless makeup was entirely ruined by thick black tracts of mascara running down her cheeks. She looked frail, broken, and utterly humiliated. As Madeline and Harrison approached the exit, Camilla practically threw herself forward, falling to her knees on the stone floor, her hands clasped together in desperate, agonizing supplication. "Madeline, Your Highness!" "Princess!" Camilla sobbed uncontrollably, abandoning all dignity. "Please, I beg of you. I was blind. I was a foolish, ignorant old woman. Forgive me. Do not banish me from my son's life. Do not destroy our family. Please look at me." Madeline stopped. She stood directly above her weeping mother-in-law. The silence in the immediate vicinity was deafening. Even the royal guard seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how the newly minted princess would exact her vengeance. Madeline looked down at the woman who had locked her in a scullery, who had starved her at the rehearsal dinner, who had tried to publicly humiliate her before the entire world. She could crush Camilla right now. She could utter a single word to her aunt and have the Davenport empire systematically dismantled by state sanctions by sunrise. But Madeline was not Camilla. She did not need to crush people to feel powerful. "Mrs. Davenport," Madeline said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a falling guillotine. "I do not destroy families. That is entirely your specialty. You have not been banished by the crown. You have simply been relocated to the exact social standing you assigned to me." Madeline did not wait for a response. She stepped gracefully around the weeping woman, holding her head high, the blood rubies blazing in the afternoon light, and walked out the heavy oak doors into the cool Scottish air, leaving Camilla Davenport completely alone in the dark. If Camilla Davenport had orchestrated the wedding ceremony to be a corporate flex, she had designed the evening reception to be an absolute coronation of her own social supremacy. The grand ballroom of Highfield Manor had been transformed into a glittering, suffocatingly opulent wonderland. Millions of imported white orchids hung suspended from the vaulted ceilings, raining down over tables draped in spun gold linens. Crystal chandeliers, older than most modern nations, cast a warm, intoxicating glow over the room. But the reception that actually took place was nothing short of a hostile state takeover. Before a single guest was allowed to enter the ballroom, Commander Thomas and his tactical team completely restructured the environment. The heavily guarded perimeter was tightened. Waitstaff were subjected to aggressive background checks and patted down in the kitchens. But the most devastating blow to the Davenport social hierarchy came in the form of the seating chart. Camilla had meticulously arranged the tables to place herself at the absolute epicenter of global power. She was meant to sit beside the ambassador of Spain, the CEO of Vanguard, and a prominent French duke. The bride's table, which Camilla had maliciously placed near the swinging kitchen doors where the draft was worst, was supposed to hold Madeline and a few unimportant low-level Davenport executives. Queen Isabella, upon inspecting the gold-embossed seating chart displayed on an easel outside the ballroom, had simply scoffed, drawn a red line through the entire document, with a pen borrowed from a terrified event planner, and issued a singular, devastating command. "Redo it." When the 300 elite guests were finally allowed into the ballroom, they discovered a completely new world order. The main head table, situated on an elevated dais overlooking the entire room, had been stripped of the Davenport name cards. It was now flanked by royal guards, standing perfectly still, their hands resting on their holsters. In the center sat Queen Isabella, looking like a terrifying hawk surveying a field of highly anxious mice. To her immediate right sat Madeline, radiant and untouchable, and to her left sat Harrison. And what of the powerful CEOs, the dukes, and the ambassadors? They were desperately scrambling to find their new seats, terrified of where the crown had placed them. Sebastian Mercer, the arrogant hedge fund titan who had mocked Madeline's lack of refinement that morning, found himself seated at a small wobbly table in the far back corner, situated dangerously close to a massive roaring fireplace that was actively causing him to sweat through his bespoke tuxedo. Beside him sat Penelope Astor, the Chanel-draped socialite, looking utterly horrified as she realized she had been placed next to the estate's head groundskeeper, a subtle punishing move orchestrated by the Queen's intelligence officers who had undoubtedly recorded all their nasty whispers. But the most spectacular, agonizing punishment was reserved for Camilla. She had not been expelled from the property, but she had been entirely stripped of her power. Camilla Davenport was seated at a tiny, solitary table designated for auxiliary staff, tucked behind a massive, towering floral arrangement that completely obstructed her view of the dais. She was physically cut off from the room. Whenever she attempted to flag down a waiter for a glass of champagne, they deliberately ignored her, terrified of drawing the Queen's ire. She sat there, her makeup ruined, her empire crumbling, watching the people who had kissed her ring yesterday desperately trying to catch Madeline's eye today. Dinner service was an exercise in pure psychological warfare. The elites ate their Michelin-starred courses in near silence, terrified that chewing too loudly might offend the monarch. Every movement was heavily scrutinized. Halfway through the main course, Penelope Astor, desperate to salvage her social standing and secure favor with the new regime, gathered her courage, abandoned her terrible seat by the groundskeeper, and slowly approached the elevated dais. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, performing a deep, exaggerated curtsy that nearly sent her toppling over in her stilettos. Your Royal Highness. Penelope stammered, her voice trembling as she looked up at Madeline. I simply wanted to come and offer my most profound, sincere congratulations. The entire room is simply captivated by your grace. We had no idea of your lineage. Had we known, we would have ensured you were treated with the absolute highest respect this weekend. Madeline paused, her silver fork hovering over her plate. She looked down at Penelope. She remembered this woman clearly. She remembered Penelope loudly complaining about Madeline's cheap perfume in the hallway just yesterday. Madeline did not raise her voice. She did not display anger. She simply weaponized the devastating, polite detachment of true royalty. Ms. Astor, is it? Madeline asked softly, her voice carrying the chill of a winter breeze. Yes, Your Highness. Penelope Astor. The socialite practically squeaked, thrilled to be recognized. Ms. Astor, I must confess I am a bit confused by your statement. Madeline said, setting her fork down and leaning forward slightly, the blood rubies catching the light of the chandeliers. You say you would have treated me with respect had you known my lineage, but true refinement, true class does not require a pedigree to be summoned. Kindness is not a luxury reserved only for the titled. It is a baseline expectation of decent humanity. Penelope's face drained of all color. She looked like she had just been slapped with a brick. To only offer respect to those you perceive as powerful. Madeline continued, her eyes locking onto the terrified socialite with lethal precision. Is the mark of a very small, very frightened person. I suggest you return to your seat, Ms. Astor. You are blocking the view of the orchestra. Penelope Astor gasped, her mouth falling open in shock, before she scrambled backward, bowing frantically and practically sprinting back to her dark corner of the room. A ripple of suppressed, terrified murmurs washed over the surrounding tables. The message was explicitly clear. The princess possessed a perfect memory. and the sycophants would find no shelter here. Queen Isabella leaned over to Harrison, taking a slow, appreciative sip of her wine. "Your bride," the queen murmured, a rare, terrifying smile playing on her lips, "has the instincts of a sniper. She's going to completely terrorize the European social season. I am deeply looking forward to it." Harrison laughed, a booming, relaxed sound that cut through the tense atmosphere of the room. He reached under the table, finding Madeline's hand and giving it a firm, proud squeeze. "She terrorizes me on a daily basis, Your Majesty. You get used to it." As the evening wore on, the balance of global power actively shifted in that ballroom. High-level executives, men who commanded billions of dollars, realized that the Davenport shipping empire was no longer controlled by Camilla. The true power now rested entirely with Harrison, backed by the unfathomable ancient wealth of the Valerius Royal Trust. One by one, under the watchful, terrifying gaze of the royal guards, the elites abandoned Camilla completely. They approached the dais not with arrogant demands, but with careful, respectful propositions, addressing Harrison directly while bowing deeply to Madeline. Camilla, watching from behind her floral barricade, realized with cold, agonizing clarity that her reign was completely irreversibly over. She had become a ghost in her own house. When it came time for the toast, there was no microphone passed to the parents of the groom. The room simply fell silent as Queen Isabella stood up, leaning gracefully on her cane. "I will keep this brief, as I find long speeches to be incredibly tedious." The queen announced, her voice effortlessly commanding the vast space. "For 26 years, the crown believed a vital piece of our legacy was lost to the shadows. Today she has returned to the light. Madeline, you wear your mother's rubies, but more importantly, you wear her courage. You survived the darkness, and you survived the pathetic, petty cruelty of those who thought they could break you." The queen's eyes flicked briefly toward the back of the room, squarely targeting the floral arrangement hiding Camilla. "To Harrison," the queen continued, raising her glass. "A man who proved that true nobility is not defined by blood, but by action. You stood ready to burn your own empire to protect my niece. Therefore, you shall have the full weight, protection, and loyalty of the crown behind yours. May your union be long, fierce, and entirely untouchable." "To the princess and her champion," the queen commanded. "To the princess and her champion." The room roared back in unison, 300 terrified elites desperately raising their glasses to the heavens. The departure of the bride and groom was an event that permanently scorched itself into the memory of every person in attendance. There was no quaint driving away in a classic car with tin cans tied to the bumper. At midnight, a massive black state-of-the-art military transport helicopter landed squarely on the manicured front lawns of Highfield Manor, its rotors violently thrashing the imported rose bushes Camilla had spent thousands of dollars installing. Madeline and Harrison walked out of the grand double doors flanked by Commander Thomas and the elite security detail. Madeline had changed out of her wedding gown and into a sleek, tailored white coat provided by her aunt's staff, though the heavy, blazing blood rubies remained securely fastened around her neck. As they walked down the stone steps, a figure emerged from the shadows of the portico. It was Camilla. She was shivering, clutching a thin shawl around her shoulders, her face a mask of total devastation. "Harrison!" Camilla rasped, her voice completely hoarse from hours of weeping. She took a tentative step forward, but a royal guard instantly blocked her path, raising a stern hand. "Harrison, please. Where are you going? When will you be back?" Harrison stopped. He looked at his mother, the woman who had meticulously plotted to destroy the love of his life for the sake of social standing. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a profound, chilling pity. "I'm not coming back, Mother," Harrison said simply, his voice calm over the roar of the helicopter blades. "You wanted me to marry into absolute power to secure the Davenport legacy. I did. But this power doesn't require your guidance. The board of directors has already been notified of my immediate transition to independent operations. You have the house. You have your friends. Enjoy them." Camilla let out a strangled, pathetic wail, crumbling against the stone pillar, as Harrison turned his back on her for the final time. He took Madeline's hand, and together they stepped into the helicopter, ascending into the night sky, leaving the toxic, ruined empire of Highfield Manor far below them. The aftermath of the Invisible Bride wedding was catastrophic and immediate. By Monday morning, the news had leaked to the global press. It was the absolute scandal of the decade. The headlines were plastered across every major news outlet on the planet: the librarian princess. How a shipping matriarch humiliated royal blood and lost an empire. The societal fallout for Camilla Davenport was absolute. The very people she had courted, the elites who had attended the wedding, aggressively distanced themselves from her to avoid the wrath of the crown. Her invitations to charity galas, state dinners, and exclusive retreats completely vanished overnight. When she attempted to call the ambassador of Spain to secure a trade route, her calls went straight to voicemail. She was radioactive. She had become the exact thing she had always terrified of: being a social outcast, trapped in a massive empty estate, completely isolated from the halls of power she so desperately craved. Sebastian Mercer and Penelope Astor found their own businesses suddenly audited by heavily armed, terrifyingly efficient tax investigators from the Royal Revenue Service. It was a subtle, invisible execution of power, proving that the Crown's memory was indeed flawless. As for Harrison, he severed his business ties with his mother's holding company, utilizing the vast, limitless resources of Madeline's Royal Trust to establish a new, devastatingly effective logistics empire based in London. He became untouchable in the corporate world, backed by sovereign wealth that made his previous competitors look like small-town merchants. And Madeline Foster, the quiet archivist, did not move into a towering royal palace, nor did she suddenly begin wearing tiaras to the grocery store. She kept her job at the historical library. She still wore oversized knit sweaters and tortoiseshell glasses, but things had fundamentally changed. The library was now heavily guarded by plainclothes intelligence officers who politely checked out books while keeping a lethal perimeter. When foreign dignitaries visited the city, they didn't meet with the Prime Minister first. They requested private audiences with the princess who had broken the Davenport Empire. She commanded a terrifying, quiet respect, navigating the global stage with a brilliant, empathetic mind that earned her the adoration of the public and the absolute fear of the corrupt. One rainy evening, 3 years after the wedding, Madeline sat in the drawing room of their London townhouse. The fire was roaring, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. Harrison was sitting on the rug going through architectural blueprints for a new children's hospital they were funding. Madeline looked down at her lap. Resting on a velvet cloth was the heavy wooden box containing the blood rubies. She rarely wore them now. They were too heavy, too ancient, too loaded with the gravity of her mother's sacrifice and her aunt's vengeance. Harrison looked up, noticing her quiet contemplation. He set the blueprints aside and moved to sit beside her on the sofa, wrapping a strong arm around her shoulders. "Thinking about the Scottish countryside?" Harrison asked, softly kissing the top of her head. "I was thinking about my mother," Madeline replied, tracing the massive, flawless stones with a gentle fingertip. "She gave up a kingdom so I could have a quiet life. And yet I ended up with a kingdom anyway." "You didn't end up with a kingdom," Harrison corrected her, smiling as he reached out and closed the lid of the wooden box, shutting away the blinding light of the rubies. "You ended up with me. The titles, the wealth, the guards. That's just the noise outside the window. And here you're just the girl who dropped a stack of medieval history books on my foot when we first met." Madeline laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that filled the room, leaning her head against his chest. He was right. The power of the crown had protected them, and the wealth had secured their future. But the true victory wasn't destroying Camilla Davenport or bringing the global elite to their knees. The true victory was surviving the crucible of their judgment, walking out the other side, and realizing that the only validation they ever needed was sitting right beside them. The Invisible Bride had conquered the world not by wearing a crown, but by refusing to let anyone make her feel small ever again. If you love this story of a toxic mother-in-law getting exactly what she deserved when her hidden bride turned out to be royalty, make sure to hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel bring you more satisfying, dramatic, and jaw-dropping real-life revenge stories just like this one. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good plot twist and hit subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss out on our daily storytelling deep dives. We have so many more incredible vindicating stories coming your way, so join our community today. Leave a comment down below telling us what you would have done if you were Harrison or Madeline in that situation. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.